August 1944 marked a turning point in the Second World War. The Allied armies, having broken out of the bloody hedgerows of Normandy, were advancing across France at a speed that had stunned both friend and foe. German units, already weakened by weeks of relentless bombardment and attritional fighting, were collapsing under the pressure. Entire convoys of vehicles were abandoned along roadsides, supplies left behind in the chaos of retreat. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered without a fight, their morale shattered and their command structure in disarray. At the forefront of this unprecedented push was General George S. Patton, one of the most audacious and relentless commanders in modern military history. Patton believed that with the speed and momentum of his Third Army, the war in Western Europe could be brought to a decisive conclusion by Christmas 1944. His tanks and armored divisions surged forward like a force of nature, exploiting every gap in German lines and leaving disorganized defenders in their wake. Soldiers spoke of the adrenaline, the sense of inevitability, and the thrill of being part of what seemed like a race to end the war itself. Yet, just as the open road to Germany lay ahead, the advance came to an unexpected halt. It wasn't enemy fire, fortified positions, or logistical failure that stopped Patton's momentum. Instead, the pause came from political necessity. Decisions made hundreds of miles behind the front lines, in smoke-filled rooms and council chambers, would dictate the pace of the battlefield. The city of Paris, its liberation a symbol of national pride and political legitimacy, became the center of a tense debate between military strategy and diplomatic calculation. What happened in those critical days outside Paris would reshape the final months of the war in Western Europe. It would determine not only how quickly the Allies could reach Germany, but also how the post-war map of Europe would be drawn. The story of August 1944 is not just one of tanks and bullets. It is a story of strategy, politics, and the high stakes of decisions made under pressure. For nearly 7 weeks after the Allied landings on D-Day, the war in France was grinding and unforgiving. Normandy's hedgerows turned the countryside into a maze of natural fortifications. Thick earthen banks, topped with dense vegetation, blocked visibility and movement. German defenders transformed each field into a killing zone, lacing approaches with machine guns, mines, and hidden artillery. Progress was measured in yards, not miles, and every advance came at a high cost in lives. By mid-July, Allied momentum seemed stalled, and the promise of a rapid breakout from Normandy looked increasingly distant. Everything changed on July 25, 1944, after an overwhelming aerial bombardment. Operation Cobra tore a massive gap in the German front near Saint-Lay. American ground forces surged forward through shattered defenses, and the rigid German line finally collapsed. Units that had held firm for weeks suddenly found themselves outflanked, cut off, or retreating in confusion. What had been a static, attritional battle transformed almost overnight into a war of movement. The true exploitation began on August 1st, when George E. S. Patton's Third Army became operational. Patton wasted no time. His armored spearheads poured through the breach and fanned out across western France with astonishing speed. Tank columns advanced so rapidly that issued maps became obsolete, and forward air controllers struggled to determine where the friendly front lines actually were. Units covered distances in days that had previously taken weeks. German commanders were stunned. Communications broke down, reserves were non-existent, and reports from the front admitted the truth. There was no longer a coherent defense in France. The initiative had decisively passed to the Allies. The question was no longer whether Germany could hold France, but how quickly its forces could escape destruction. Momentum had shifted completely, and for the first time since D-Day, the road ahead seemed wide open. Patton's remarkable advance across France was breathtaking, but it came at a staggering logistical cost. His Third Army, moving faster than any army had in modern history, devoured nearly 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. Every mile of advance required trucks full of gasoline, ammunition, food, and spare parts to travel hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches along tenuous supply lines. Roads were often clogged, bridges damaged, and every delay risked slowing the armored columns racing ahead. To meet this demand, the Allies created the Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy of trucks operating around the clock. Drivers faced grueling conditions, navigating mud, potholes, and the threat of enemy air attacks, all while working shifts with little rest. Despite this Herculean effort, the pace of supply could barely keep up with the relentless momentum of Patton's tanks. The army was pushing the limits of both men and machines. Patton was fully aware of the risks. Fuel shortages could strand his forces in the middle of hostile territory, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. Yet he calculated that hesitation was far more dangerous than running dry. To Patton, momentum itself was a weapon. The faster his units moved, the less time German forces had to regroup or establish defensive lines. He famously ordered his commanders to advance relentlessly, even if the tanks ran completely out of fuel along the way. By mid-August, the results of this high-speed gamble were clear. Paris was within reach, and beyond it lay open countryside stretching all the way to Germany. The German army, reeling from the collapse of its front lines, appeared unable to respond effectively. Patton's audacious strategy demonstrated the raw power of mobility and initiative in modern warfare, but it also underscored a fundamental tension. Speed without supply was a race against exhaustion, mechanical failure, and the limits of logistics. Balancing these forces would define whether the Allies could turn this fleeting advantage into a decisive victory. Paris was far more than a strategic objective. It was the beating heart of France, a symbol of national pride, political legitimacy, and post-war authority. For General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, the liberation of the French capital was not just a military operation, it was a moral and political imperative. De Gaulle insisted that French forces, not Americans or British, must be the ones to enter the city first. To him, allowing foreign armies to take the lead would undermine France's sovereignty and weaken his position as the rightful post-war leader inside Paris. The stakes were immediate and life or death. The French resistance had risen in open rebellion against the occupying German forces. Civilians fought alongside irregular fighters in the streets, and many were dying in the process. Meanwhile, the German commander, Dietrich von Choltitz, had explicit orders from Hitler. If the uprising spiraled out of control, Paris was to be destroyed. Bridges were rigged with explosives, historic monuments were threatened, and the population teetered on the brink of catastrophe. Every day of delay increased the risk of irreversible destruction. For Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the situation was a delicate balancing act between military efficiency and political necessity. On one hand, Patton's Third Army was poised to continue the rapid advance toward Germany, potentially ending the war months earlier. Stopping now could give German forces a precious window to regroup and fortify. On the other hand, refusing de Gaulle's demand could fracture the fragile coalition between the Allies and alienate the French leadership, creating long-term political complications in liberated France. Ultimately, Eisenhower chose to prioritize alliance and political unity over immediate battlefield advantage. He ordered a temporary halt to the American advance, redirecting supplies and support to the French forces preparing to enter Paris. This decision ensured that the city would be liberated by its own people, preserving France's dignity and reinforcing de Gaulle's legitimacy. But it came at the cost of temporarily slowing the momentum of the Allied armies. The decision highlighted a recurring tension in coalition warfare, the intersection of strategy, politics, and the human cost of delay. The decision to divert resources to support the liberation of Paris had immediate and profound consequences on the battlefield. Supplies that had been fueling Patton's unstoppable advance, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, were now redirected to sustain French forces and maintain order within the city. The Third Army, which had been moving at an almost unprecedented pace, ground to a halt. Tanks, trucks, and armored units waited on roadsides, idling as logistical priorities shifted hundreds of miles behind the front line. German commanders, ever alert to shifts in Allied movements, quickly recognized the opportunity. Among them was Field Marshal Walter Model, recently dispatched to the Western Front by Hitler to stabilize the faltering German forces. Model found a desperate situation, units scattered across France, communication networks in disarray and morale near collapse. Yet the pause in the American advance provided the breathing room he desperately needed. Recognizing the rare chance to regroup, Model immediately ordered a full withdrawal toward Germany. Every available soldier, vehicle, and artillery piece was concentrated along the Siegfried Line. Germany's heavily fortified western frontier, what had previously been chaos on the German side, disorganized retreats, abandoned positions, and panicked units, was transformed into a formidable defensive system. Roads that had once been wide-open avenues for Patton's tanks were now lined with prepared positions, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles. German engineers reinforced key points, artillery was emplaced, and fresh divisions from the interior were brought forward to fill gaps. By the time Patton's forces resumed their advance, the landscape had changed completely. The rapid, nearly unstoppable momentum that had defined the race across France was gone. Instead of fleeing columns and empty roads, American units now faced entrenched defenses and a calculated, well-prepared enemy. The pause at Paris had effectively bought Germany a critical week, turning what could have been total collapse into an organized resistance that would significantly prolong the war in Western Europe. It was a stark reminder of how political decisions far from the front lines could have dramatic and unintended consequences on the battlefield. By early September 1944, the rapid, almost unstoppable momentum of the Allied advance across France had come to an abrupt halt. What had been a thrilling pursuit of a collapsing enemy was now transformed into a grueling and methodical campaign. Patton's Third Army, which had once seemed unstoppable, faced an enemy that was no longer fleeing but firmly entrenched. German forces had used the precious week granted by the pause outside Paris to reorganize, fortify, and prepare defensive positions along the Siegfried Line. The roads that had been wide-open avenues to Berlin were now lined with concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and well-positioned artillery. Logistical challenges compounded the problem. Fuel shortages returned with a vengeance as supply lines struggled to keep pace with advancing armies. Resources that might have supported Patton's tanks were redirected to other operations, particularly to Field Marshal Montgomery's northern campaign in Belgium. The relentless pace that had defined the summer now gave way to a grinding battle of attrition, where every mile forward was paid for in blood and precious lives. Soldiers who had expected to be nearing the German border in weeks instead found themselves facing months of entrenched resistance and exhausting combat. Historians continue to debate whether ending the war in 1944 was ever truly feasible. Some argue that the Allies were poised to break into Germany before the onset of autumn, while others point to logistical constraints and the resilience of German defenses as obstacles that made rapid victory unlikely. German generals, however, were candid in their post-war assessments. They acknowledged that the pause around Paris had provided them with invaluable time to regroup, reinforce, and establish strong defensive positions that otherwise would have been impossible. That single week altered the course of the campaign, turning what could have been a fast, decisive sweep into a slow, costly struggle that extended the war into 1945. In the end, the momentum of the summer became a distant memory, replaced by the grinding reality of a protracted and brutal fight through prepared German defenses. Wars are not won by generals alone, they are shaped by politics, alliances, and decisions made far from the battlefield. If you want more stories where strategy collides with power, where history turns on a single decision, subscribe to the channel. Like the video and share your thoughts below. Do you think Eisenhower made the right choice? Or was Patton's gamble the lost chance to end the war early? Let's discuss.